Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm Jen, your co-host today, and I am here with one of my illustrious colleagues and friends. Do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm illustrious, and I am Jessica. How are you?
Great, thank you. And we are both illustrious, and we are both here with an illustrious author. Would you like to introduce yourself and the book that we are here to discuss today?
I am also illustrious. I love this. Hi, everybody. My name is Lesley Livingston, and I will be your illustrious author for this podcast. I wrote my most recent book that I've written is called Queen Among the Dead, and it is published by Zando. And it is a story of a feisty young princess, warrior, rebel, king, queen, wannabe, named Neve. It is set in ancient magical Ireland, and it is full of shapeshifters and magic and romance and bloodshed, because those two things clearly go hand in hand. And it's releasing on January 17th, and I could not possibly be more excited. Like, seriously, I am so excited for this book. It's crazy.
We are too. Like, this is such an exciting book, and it just combines so many of my own personal interests because
and mine I have to say, because that was one of the things Jen Jen and I sometimes we stalk what's coming out.
Yes.
And Jen's just like Celtic mythology and druids and all of this, and I was like, yes, let's do this.
Well, I had you guys in mind when I was writing the book. I clearly.
Yeah,
that should have been your blurb on the back. Like, you don't need a synopsis, you just need that with like pictures making, I don't know, fist bumps at each thing.
Yeah, like this this book combines so many of my own particular interests with like the Irish history and fantasy and speculative fiction and all of the sort of like mythological intrusions and the bits of real history. And I'm wondering if we could just get started with you telling us a little bit about like how you got into these topics, like the speculative fiction and the Celtic history, and how that all kind of brought you to this book. I know it's a big question, but
when I was a very small child, actually, truly, when I was a very small child, I think I spent a lot of time annoying my grade school librarian. I thought recess was for chumps. I didn't want to go and run around a field. What do I want to do that for? So I spent a lot of time creeping into the library. She was always like, oh my God, here's a book. Go. I have to catalog these things. Please leave me alone, small blonde child. And I spent a lot of time with these books that she would give me, and they somehow I kind of gravitated towards the ones that were based in mythology and folklore and fairy tales. The D'Aulaire's books, the Greek and Roman mythology, and the Norse mythology books were huge. Like, I imprinted on those like a duckling, and they kind of led me into like a lot of classical mythology, but also Celtic mythology. And I have a familial Celtic background, Scottish and Irish and Welsh, and I just sort of I kind of dove into that stuff and fairy mythology and folklore, and it just really grabbed me when I was fairly young, and never let go, and I guess I never let go of it. And I just, before I published my first trilogy, which we were talking about just before we actually started recording, my Wondrous Strange trilogy, which is basically a fairy tale set in New York, but it's a lot of sort of Celtic fairy lore and Irish mythology kind of jammed into a contemporary urban setting. I had kind of built up all of this sort of background knowledge just from the stuff I read growing up, and the book series that I read, and I was very into Arthurian mythology, and it all just sort of went into the pot and kept simmering. And over the years, as I was writing more books, and I wrote my Never series, which was ancient Britain, and I wrote the Wonder Strange books, which then sort of spiraled into my Starling books, which are, you know, a combination of like all sorts of different mythologies, and again in New York City, a mythological melting pot, as it were. That one was fun to write. I always had this kind of idea brewing in the back of my mind about this particular character that I wanted to write. And I wrote the Valiant books next, which were my latest published series, which was set in ancient Rome with a female gladiator. I gravitated toward women with swords also, in case anybody was wondering. It's just a thing. I come from a theatrical background, and I did a lot of Shakespeare, and I also did a lot of stage fighting, and I in my mind, I'm always choreographing fight scenes. Strangely enough, it's an awful lot like choreographing kissing scenes. Just FYI, like in my brain, I write them.
Back to that eventually. We're going to put in that, and we're going to be like fight scenes, kissing scenes. Let's chat.
Love that. Yes, thank you.
Yes, we will get back to that. But yes, so I had this character that was kind of roaming around in the back of my head. This girl who was very strong, and she was throne adjacent. She was royalty adjacent, but almost kind of like Prince Hal in Henry V. She wasn't ever going to get the throne. She wasn't ever going to get to rule for various reasons. And so she kind of developed this rebellious personality and wound up, you know, not acting in the way that a typical princess would. And it was very strange, because I usually write from a place to people. I usually come up with like a sort of a setting and a world to people with these characters that I then write their stories. And with Neve, she sort of came first, and she was looking for a place for me to put her. And it's interesting that while I was doing some research into some ancient myths, I came across this myth of the reason why Scotland is named Scotland, and it has to do with an Egyptian princess who traveled prehistorically from Egypt to Ireland and then eventually to Scotland, and those sort of areas. And her name is Scota, and it's a very, 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 very apocryphal legend. It's like a little tiny snippet of mythology, but it gave me this princess who travels from a very faraway place to Ireland, which I've always had a fascination with, and set her there, and gave her that world, and gave me that world to play with. And then I started getting into like Irish werewolf mythology, which is a thing, believe it or not, and the idea of setting something in the environs of Newgrange and Tara, which are ancient Irish ruins, which are they exist. Like everybody's sort of familiar visually with the idea of Newgrange. It's the temple. It's the ancient Irish monument with the huge green dome and the white stone face that's got the single entrance. And at winter solstice every year, the sun rises and a beam of sunlight shoots down this tunnel and illuminates this chamber, and nobody knows why.
I have to say, so my name is in a drawing. You know, when you go to Newgrange, you can put your name in a drawing to actually be invited on winter solstice.
Oh,
that. And I mean, I went to Scotland like I did go to Scotland over 15 years ago, but Ireland I went to over 15 years ago, because I went to Ireland before I went to Scotland. So I have not been picked. But you know, I mean, I was told when I went there that that's like a lifetime thing. Like you put it in once and you always have a chance to be picked. And I don't know if that is true, but there's always a chance.
Keep checking your email. That's what I say.
Yeah,
that's
right.
Well, the thing about Newgrange is that it predates Stonehenge. It predates the building of the pyramids. And again, there was this interesting sort of Egyptian tie-in with that sort of thing, in that Newgrange is constructed in a very similar way to the mastaba, I don't even know if I pronounced that right, mastaba or mastaba, I'm not sure, but the grave structures in Egypt that predate the pyramids. They were low to the ground. They usually had a single entrance. They were shaped similarly. They were constructed similarly, and the pyramids basically wound up with them sort of piling smaller and smaller mastabas on top of each other in a sort of like a wedding cake kind of formation, and then just eventually filling in the sides. Like there was the step pyramids, and then there were the actual pyramids. But they started off with these structures, and one of them, which no longer exists, belonged to an ancient queen. And there are a couple of ancient Egyptian legends about these queens who have really interesting stories to them. And one is this queen named Nitocris, who sort of becomes my Queen Neve, who becomes the Scathach. It'll all make sense when you read the book, I promise. But she's Neve's ancestress, and she is sort of the backstory to everything that kind of happens to Neve, and Neve is sort of her legacy, and she is kind of something that Neve needs to escape to become the person that she's going to become. But she's got this fascinating backstory of vengeance and fierceness, and she's this warrior queen who basically she locked all of her enemies in a giant banquet hall after inviting them over, all unawares, and then shut all the doors and opened up a big one that let the river Nile in and drowned them all, and then she hit the road. And I kind of, in my mind, I had this interesting moment where I conflated her backstory with the story of the Egyptian princess who traveled to Ireland, and then a whole bunch of legends of the Tuatha Dé sort of folded themselves into that, and this entire story started to build with Neve at the center. And the really amazing thing about Ireland at that time, and being that ancient and that removed from history, is that nobody really knows what Tara looked like when it was built. There are like foundations that are left in the ground, and these interesting, sort of spiral buildings and everything else. And I sort of wanted to build a society of these kind of almost godlike beings who had come from somewhere else, which is all in ancient Irish mythology. There's these series of tribes that come to Ireland from somewhere else, and they have these almost godlike powers. And I wanted to set it in kind of almost an Atlantean setting. So it's like there's this magical kingdom that is built partially with magic, and it no longer exists. Like we don't know what Tara looked like. We don't know exactly what Newgrange was for. We don't know what all these little magical barrows were constructed for, what their purpose was, what this society looked like. And it wound up becoming this interesting clash between essentially two cultures in Ireland, the one that was already there, and then Neve's people who came and just decided to take over and rule. And she has a lot of trouble dealing with that, sort of from an ethical standpoint. And also she wants to set things right in a lot of ways, within herself and also within her kingdom. And and then she runs into handsome rogues from the other side of the tracks, and a pack of shape-shifting warrior wolf women who become something of an inspiration to her, and then off we go. So
yeah, this question touches on everything that you've just been talking about. And because everything that you've just been saying, it is so clear that you are really well grounded in not only the history, but in where the gaps in the history are, and how mythology relates to both the history and the gaps, and I am wondering, just when you were approaching all this and determining the setting for your story and how your characters were going to operate in this world, what was your approach to how you fill the gaps, how do you create your story where the history doesn't exist, if that makes sense?
That's amazing that you should ask that, because I often say that the gaps are my favorite parts, because they are the places where you can where you build a house and then you get to furnish it, and you get to make things happen inside the structure. And yeah, that's the thing about that, about Irish mythology, Celtic mythology in general, but Irish mythology, and also like fairy mythology and that sort of thing. There are so many different versions that you can pull one thread out of a particular myth, and you can follow that thread, even though it's wound up around a whole bunch of other threads and a whole bunch of different versions of those stories. Like there are so many different stories about so many different characters in Irish mythology, and you can pluck up one thread here and it doesn't tie into the same story with the same character over here unless you sort of make it. And you can kind of, it's like picking apart a tapestry and kind of reweaving it, but using the same threads and the same theme. And you can live in those gaps. Like for example, I don't know, it's just taking the general idea of the series of invasions in Ireland. There was the Fomori and the Tuatha Dé, and the idea of the Liathel, the Stone of Destiny, and bringing all these things over. And then then I would bring in the little bit of the Egyptian mythology idea of this completely bonkers idea of this Egyptian princess coming over and ruling in Ireland, and prehistorically. And so I got to weave that little bit of a completely unrelated myth in there, and then I got to play around with some of the names and the sounds of the words, and Scota and Scathach, and I got to bring in her Scythian or Scythian counterparts, her warrior charioteers and horsemen, and yes, I do conflate some things, and I do fudge some timelines a little bit to not fudge. There's magic, and like I say, it is sort of almost an Atlantean kind of thing, in that there is this this broad canvas with these sort of, like, the walls are built and the roof struts are there, and I need to finish it and furnish it according to the story. And the great thing about it is that generally, once you start peopling these stories with your characters, they will find the places that they will fill in the story. And it winds up being kind of fascinating. Like and also what I was saying about setting is that there are always places that I hang bits of story on. And Newgrange was a huge one. And just sort of the why and the wherefore of that thing, which exists and which has its own stories, many of them. But then there were other stories that I wound up sort of finding in the landscape around there. Like I needed this sort of rough and tumble town full of these Furbolg peasants, or like the people who already lived there when the Fomori came, these shapeshifters came in and took over, which is one of the legends. And then the Tuatha Dé came in and they took over. And so I needed this rough and tumble town, and I needed something that would sound plausible. And there is a place very close to where I needed, on the confluence of rivers, modernly called Blackwater. And I was like, well, that works, because that says everything I needed to say about that place. And that gave rise to some of the details of the magic that's already living in the land and in the rivers, and how there's the magic that's already inherent there is kind of corrupting somewhat, and there is this danger in the natural magic in the world there, and it's not necessarily or always a benevolent thing. And I was like, that sprung largely from me delving into all the maps around the Blackwater and going, that's exactly where I need it. It's this distance from there, so I can get there in this amount of time, and I can get there. And then for Neve's mother's retreat, where she's gone off to, and Neve goes to find her. Again, I was looking for some place really kind of cool and interesting, and I found this tiny little lake right on the coast, on the northern coast, right on this cliff's head. You can zoom in on a map and actually see where Neve goes, and you can find little pictures of it, and there's a little tiny lake with a little tiny stone prehistoric broch in the middle of it, like this little cranach was built on this island, and it's man-made, and it's there, and like the remains are there. And so I was like, okay, now I get to thread some of the story up there, and in doing that, I got to build out the landscape from that. So a lot of it is taking all of these different sort of disparate bits and doing a lot of sort of mental crochet, I guess, and hoping you don't drop too many threads along the way.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking, one thing that's like really amazing about just this whole process that you talk about, it's so interesting when you read fantasy. There's so many different ways people go about it. And, it's like what I love is that, like, this is like historical fantasy, and like you really committed to there being landmarks, and like making it feel very tangible. And I think that is like really commendable. Did you like, was there ever a point where like something hit a snag because one thing and the other didn't really fit, where you just like, okay, I want to do this, or I want to go here, but there's not, like, it's not, the flow didn't really work?
Strangely enough, no, it was actually kind of the opposite. I know. And this is a weird thing that frequently happens when I'm writing, and I don't, sometimes I can't overthink it, because otherwise I'm like, oh God, what if it never happens again? Because it was like, honest to God, when I was writing the Wondrous Strange books, the same sort of thing happened. My editor, Laura Arnold at the time, was, I kept sending her, the story as it was progressing, and she was an editor in New York City, and I, so much of that story hinged on landmarks in New York, in like things, monuments in Central Park, the Croton Reservoir aqueduct that used to exist where the library is now, but which is no longer there, but used to look like an ancient, and here we go again, and this is a weird thread that goes through a lot of my stories, is an ancient Egyptian temple. Like that's how the reservoir was built, to look like this massive temple at Karnak. And like, Edgar Allan Poe would like wander around the top of it on moonlit nights and stare into the waters and like think Edgar Allan Poe thoughts.
How very
like
right? I'm like, that is the most Edgar Allan Poe thing.
Is it not? I know, it's astonishing. But then that was
the original emo or something, right?
Oh, absolutely, like god of emos. But the hilarious thing is that was demolished, but there is a staircase at the corner of inside the library now, that is the outer walls of what used to be the Croton Aqueduct are still there, and there's like these rough stone walls with this frosted glass staircase that go down into the depths towards like a lecture theater, something like that. But like it goes, if you stare down, it's like this glass frosted staircase and this rough hewn thing. And when I was writing my Starling books, I was like, I need an entrance into the underworld. Wait a minute. And I had, because of like the Cleopatra's Needle in Central Park and all these things, one of the characters I had wandering around that story was Anubis, the ancient Egyptian god of the dead, who owned a jazz club up on like, the Upper East Side. So he was my entrance to that. So there was that, and there was like the Hellgate Bridge and all of these things in North Brother Island. I kept finding all these weird landmarks around New York and folding them into the story, and they all just like I couldn't have written the story without them. It was like there, and I'm like, oh well, of course that's a plot point. That's a major plot point that already exists. And it got to the point where Laura was like, "What are you making North Brother Island? Are you making this up?" And I said, "No, Laura, it's actually there." And she's like, she started calling me New York City supernatural biographer, which I thought was hilarious, because I kept coming up with all these weird little like cryptic places that I could attach, a bit of fairy lore to. And when I wrote the Never books, the same sort of thing happened, in that I was writing about Boudica and the ancient Iceni rebellion against the Romans. And I needed if you've ever seen the Battersea Shield, which again is one of those things that lives in people's memories, it's the bronze shield that was found in the Thames River. It's got the big bronze circle hump in the middle and then two smaller humps on either side, and it's decorated with swirling patterns. And in my mind, I wanted to, because Boudica's gravesite has never technically been found, and I was like, I want to put her in something. I wanted that to be a grave marker, like a diorama. I want to use the shield as like a here, find this, and you will find her. And I was like, I'm gonna have to make this up, because that particular grave barrow formation does not exist anywhere in Britain in the way that I want it to, I'm quite sure. And then I found it. And there is, in Iceni territory, right exactly where I needed it on a map, there is the remains of a field, a barrow field. There were several different grave barrows there. The only ones that are extant today, and the middle one is the highest extant grave mound in Britain, and there are two on either side of it in exactly the dimensions and formation that you could pick up the Battersea shield and drop it on top of them, and it would be like, oh, okay. That's and I when I found them on a map, and I zoomed in, and I was like, goosebumps. And it was crazy. I was prepared to actually just make it up. Like, that's what I do. I'm an author. I write fiction. I was going to make it up. I didn't have to. And that was, it was bizarre and hilarious. And that's sort of what happened with this book too. Like I said, I had this character before I had the place, which is a little different for me. And my partner, my guy John, was like, one day he goes, well, hey, what do you know about Newgrange? I was like, a fair amount. And he's like, well, you're sort of looking for a setting. It seems kind of cool. And I was like, nah. I was busy. I was doing something else. I don't know. I was like playing with a cat. and then like and my agent and I and the woman who's my editor now, Tiffany Liao, who is brilliant. We were sort of workshopping this idea of this story with this character, and we hadn't quite set the parameters of the story yet. We knew it was like an ancient kingdom, and we just didn't know which one. And then a week after John had said this to me, I was getting ready to go to LA for some meetings, and I had to wake up early the next morning. And so I was like, trying to get some sleep, being a good girl, went to bed early. And I was like, just drifting off. And I was like, Newgrange. Oh, I'm not going to get any sleep tonight. Damn. The next morning, I was just a mess. So I was like, and John's like, what's wrong with you? And I'm like, it's your fault. He's like, what did I do? I'm like, Newgrange. And he's like, you are so odd. And like, I call up my agent. I'm like, I gotta have a conference call with Tiff, because I know where it is. I know what we're doing now. And the story just drifted down onto this setting. Like, the setting was just waiting me to to smarten the hell up and figure out that's where it was. And frequently that happens, where John will just be like, hey, what about, and I'm like, oh yeah, of course. And so that's very helpful. And because we co-write things together, and every now and then it's just like, oh right, yeah, of course.
Wow, that's so interesting to me, because like it really drives home for me like how specific the setting feels like in this book, but then also how these very like timeless themes about like the movement of people and colonialism and how cultures move and change and power and all those things, like those all feel kind of timeless, and so the balance between like historical specificity and these sort of like universal issues is like is very, very interesting to me. And so I'm wondering about like how, like, I saw connections between like the use of magic and how that relates to like empire and power and indigenous cultures, and how various people like get access to resources. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about like what your approach was to all that, and how like themes of empire feed into like the fantasy setting, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that's something that's always kind of fascinated me, especially with like writing books and setting them in sort of the time periods I do. It was just, you weren't living unless you were being conquered, or conquering, or something like that. It's sort of, I guess it's a little bit thematic for my last couple of sort of more historically based novels, like the Valiant novels are there's no magic in them really whatsoever. There is, people's in their belief systems, but there's no schwa, there's no sparkling. For the first time in my life, when I wrote that trilogy, I could not get my lead character into and or out of trouble by use of magic. So that was interesting for me. Fallon, she is a Celtic princess who is abducted, sold into slavery, shipped off to Rome, and bought by a ludus, a gladiator school who trains female gladiators. And so that was kind of a big thing in that story as well, because she has grown up in the shadow of her sister, who was a great warrior who was lost during the invasion, during Julius Caesar's invasion of Britain. And when she gets to Rome and gets to this school for gladiatrixes, she discovers it is owned and operated by none other than Julius Caesar, which it is awkward, mostly for Julius Caesar, because she's like, I have just been bought by my mortal enemy, who she has grown up wanting to stick a knife into for her entire life. And then she has to deal with a lot with the feelings that she actually winds up developing a certain amount of respect for him and for what he does, not necessarily how he does it. And she is sort of caught between two worlds in that respect, in that she has to deal with how she becomes a popular figure in Rome and becomes this superstar, and her life changes dramatically and for the better. She becomes all these things that she always wanted to be, but at the same time, she's dealing with the fact that she's essentially doing it at the behest of a person who enslaved a lot of her people and enslaved a lot of her the Gaulish tribes, and she winds up befriending Vercingetorix, and she has to deal with a lot of those feelings of how do I deal with the fact that I have friends on both sides of this argument, and I have power on both sides of this argument. And interestingly enough, and this is sort of similarly when I wrote the Never books, those are my sort of they're like a fun romp of time travel with a modern girl who winds up back in Britain during the Roman invasion, and she befriends one of Boudica's daughters, and she sees the Roman invasion from the perspective of Boudica and Boudica's daughters, even though Boudica goes completely off the rails and starts even massacring her own people who befriend the Romans, and she's like, no, you're traitors and you almost die. And that, there's a 6-inch layer of ash underneath the city of London that was left of Londinium when Boudica was done with it, historically. Like, there's actually a Boudican level. And she rebelled against an invading force, but at the same time, in doing so, she kind of decimated her own culture at the same time. And then in book 2, Claire's best friend Allie goes back in time, and she winds up on the other side of the equation. She winds up falling in love with a Roman soldier back then, who is doing things for all the right reasons, but at the same time has serious moral dilemma about what's going on with this army that is invading this indigenous people. And so there's a lot of, I guess it's always been something I'm kind of interested in those sort of in those conversations, and with and as I say, those are my slightly more realistic, even though there's time travel and those are my slightly more realistic sort of sticking my toe into that conversation. But with Queen Among the Dead, Neve is coming at it from the point of view of, again, being a very, like, she's benefited from being one of the members of the ruling class, and they are an elite privileged, magical, super awesome, sparkly people who live in palaces in this gorgeous land full of magic, and they are hoarding the magic and not playing nice with the indigenous peoples or forces in that land. Like they treat the Furbolg terribly. Her ancestors came in and basically just annihilated the Fomori, who were also a conquering race, though. Like the Furbolg, they've been there to be conquered by the Fomori, who are these shape-shifting, monstrous, beautiful but monstrous people, who then the Tuatha came in and got rid of them. So they're like, yay! And oh no, not so great. Okay, so the Furbolg are basically, they're just trying to like freaking live. And one of the characters actually sort of personifies that, in that she is, she's an orphan from when her mother, who practiced very small magic, she's Furbolg, and her mother practiced very small magics when she was a child. And the Tuatha are trying to hoard all the magic and basically get rid of all the people who are practitioners. And so she was left bereft at a very young age because her mother was taken from her, and for doing tiny things like healing spells, like kitchen witch stuff. But and so that becomes a thing for that character, which becomes a motivating issue. And Neve starts to see just exactly what is wrong with her culture, and with the rot in the roots of this glorious tree that has grown up is rotten to the core down below. And she starts to really see that it becomes her duty to set things right, for not just for her own people, but very much for everybody else who lives in Ireland, who has suffered under the heel of her father and her ancestors. Did that answer that question?
Yeah, so much. I was going to say, I would just like to get a drink with you, or a cider, and just like be like, let's talk mythology. Because
let's do it.
But I want to go back, before we close out, I want to go back to your whole thing before that. You were talking about fighting scenes and kissing scenes. Because that is that is an analogy that I need to understand. So please, how is a raven like a writing desk? How is a kissing scene like
how is a kissing scene like a stabbing?
Yeah.
Like I say, I come from this theatrical background where I spent a lot of time either watching fights be choreographed or participating in fight scenes. I love the act of choreographing battle scenes and fight scenes and like rapier and dagger and longsword and broadsword, and watching how that works out on stage, and watching the choreographer move the actors around and have them engage in a fight, which to me and to a good fight choreographer is never ever just about the fight. It's always about moving the plot forward and developing character moments, which you can do through a fight, which you have to do through a fight, as far as I'm concerned. It's the way people engage in combat and the way people fight and the way you choreograph something. It's like, okay, I need a big battle to take place here, but at the same time, the way it takes place, it should never just be a fight for a fight's sake, as far as I'm concerned. There should always be, you should always come away from a martial engagement with some sort of insight into the people fighting it. And so that's also, it's kind of fun to work out just, like just how the weapons move, and in your head, you kind of, like when you guys can't, this is just audio, so you can't see, you guys can see me doing this, but I'm swooping my hands through the air right now and crossing my fingers and because when I choreograph fight scenes, I will sit in front of, I will hover over my computer keyboard and I will be like, okay, so this comes in, and okay, so but that's got to get underneath her arm, but okay, so she's fighting a guy who's used to fighting on horseback, so he's going to come at her from over the top of his head, so she can kind of swoop underneath that, because she kind of knows where he's coming from. And okay, so he's got an axe, and she can, okay, she can, but okay, the momentum takes it this, and yeah, so it looks like I'm doing some sort of like weird interpretive dance, and I'm sure it's quite ridiculous at the time, but I love writing fight scenes that are, as I say, character illuminative. And the same thing with kissing scenes and with romance scenes is that it's always a tug of war, and you want to keep the rope between the two characters tight enough that it doesn't slack in the middle and hit the ground. But you don't want to keep it too tight that, one of them gets pulled over and you lose your dynamic. So it's like, the way you write a kissing scene is very much like, are they coming face to face? Are they, how close do they get at any one point? How does he swoop in like this, and why? Why is he going for the side of her neck? Why? What happens when when his lips wind up here? Like where? And I mean, a lot of it is sort of physically moving people through space with your words, but at the same time, it's also, I love, writing little bits of characters, like, does he go straight for the lips, or is he an earlobe man, like, and why? And does he need to whisper something in there? And how do you describe the tension between two characters when they're in that situation, and is there tension, and why, and what are they trying to say to each other through their actions? So it's always a matter of writing character in action scenes, and that's very fun to me.
That's like an incredibly astute insight, I think, because of like, especially like with how I think fighting and kissing scenes are perceived, like they're often perceived as like filler, or just like the titillating stuff, that like people are waiting to get for the story.
Yeah, sure.
But they actually like, entail all this like really intense choreography and like power exchanges, like, and so they're
exactly.
like
That's exactly
really so much more interesting than
100%. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. And frequently they're I mean, sometimes they are, or should be, almost indistinguishable. Like there are scenes where Neve and Roman Ronan, my guy, where Neve and Ronan come face to face in such a way that you don't know if she's going to kiss him or punch him. And you shouldn't end up until it happens. And sometimes, she totally should have punched him there. Yeah.
I think of Army of Darkness. First you want to kiss me, now you want to kiss me.
Yeah. That's exactly it. And there's there's those scenes where like he's like, yeah, okay, so I think he actually says to her at one point, like she's kind of got her lips fastened on his throat, and he's like, and she's like, what's wrong? And he's like, I'm used to having your blade at my throat, not your lips. What's going on? And he has to figure out for her actions, like, okay, so the dynamic has shifted somewhat here, and I need to know why, but I'm somewhat distracted. So yeah, it's also, they're just so much fun to write.
So before we close out, will there be more? Are we going to return? Is this a possible, fingers crossed, maybe? Okay, cool. Awesome. Nice.
I would love to continue on with this story. I really would. And it's I have things in my head. We'll see. It's always a we'll see. But boy, howdy, I have things I would like to make my characters do. Yeah.
Nice.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
But again, any author always does. I mean, I still have things I want to make my characters from Wonder Strange do. And yeah, so there you go.
Would you ever go back to that series ever?
I have actually a really fun idea that's almost a little prequel-y for that one that I would.
Fair enough. All right. We don't have to talk more about that, but I like that.
But yeah,
yeah. Awesome. Awesome. I wonder if it's what I'm thinking of. I'm not going to say anything. Jen,
we'll discuss this one over that cider.
yeah, that sounds good. All right. This was amazing. Jen, do you have the other questions?
I don't. This has been fabulous. And I'm so glad to hear that you are, like willing to return to this world and to previous worlds you visited because like they're all so rich and so interesting. And we hope that like you'll come back to the show and talk about us to, these other entries into this world because like they're very exciting.
I would love to do that. I always sort of look at the things I write as almost all existing in the same sandbox, just in very far-flung corners of it. Like I am not beyond, thinking that Fallon and Neve exist in the same actual universe, just in different time periods and different, places, and also, existing in the same universe as Kelly in New York City, and Claire in wherever time period Claire is existing in at any one particular point. Yeah, I mean, I always like it's a big sandbox, and I am willing to go at it with a backhoe. or a tiny little shovel. It's, it's all archaeology. I'm just scraping away the layers and finding the stories. That's kind of how I think about it. It's not. It's way more, just basically staring at a pile of sand and going, I don't know.
One grain at a time, like
one grain at a time. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming to the show. This
Thank
has
you for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Totally. Come back.
Yes, please come back. Like this has been such a delight. Yeah, so readers, listeners right now, you'll be reading in the future. Please pick up Queen Among the Dead. It is so great, and you will have such a good time with it. This has been Jen and Jess in conversation with Lesley Livingston, and it is time to close this chapter. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, you guys.
Bye. Have a good one.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.